All right, everybody, welcome back to Gameday Cooking, where I cook during ESPN's College Game Day for College Game Day. That's usually how it works out. This is week 2, and we're not going to deviate too far from what I did last week. Still making some Tex-Mex items, and it's still going to be a type of enchilada. We still have the corn tortillas rolled up with cheese and fried, but the difference this week is instead of smothering it with queso, we're going to smother it with a brown chili gravy. Now, if you were to walk into any Tex-Mex restaurant in Texas, and Mexican restaurants fall in that category because they're all Tex-Mex. If you were to walk into any Tex-Mex restaurant in Texas and order a cheese enchilada, what I'm about to make is what you're going to get. One of my favorite Tex-Mex foods of my childhood, my most ordered food of my childhood at Mexican restaurants. The brown enchilada, the classic cheese enchilada smothered with a brown chili gravy. And if you're gonna have a Tex-Mex restaurant in Texas, you better make a pretty damn good cheese enchilada smothered with brown chili gravy. A little bit more complex than what we did last week with the soft cheese taco, but not too hard. This is still a pretty basic enchilada that we're gonna make. So ingredients-wise, we're gonna need to make a roux, so that means flour and some kind of oil. I like to use Crisco here, but you can use vegetable oil, peanut oil, any type of oil that you can use to make a roux with. You're gonna need some cumin. Ground cumin, salt and pepper, garlic powder, ground oregano, chili powder. Now for the chili powder, you got your basic bottled chili powders like this. You also have more complex chili powders out there, and you can even make your own by grinding down chili pods down. For this recipe, you don't need anything fancy. This will do right here. But for the more complex chili powders, the red ones for example, stay tuned. I got one of those recipes coming up in the future. Non-stick cooking spray, beef broth, corn tortillas, once again not flour, corn tortillas. And the larger the better, the largest you can find. These are the Guerrero brand, 30 count, king size yellow tortillas. You can also use white, it doesn't matter. I prefer yellow. Ground beef, fat content up to you. I pick 80-20 here. Diced yellow onions, optional, but I don't think this dish is complete without it. Same with cilantro, completely optional, but I think it's mandatory on my end. And lastly, the most important part, the cheese. Now, I still have some leftover cheese from last week in here, but this isn't what's going to go inside the tortilla. I'll show you what it's for in a bit. What's going inside the tortilla are these two cheeses. I like to use a blend. First off, medium cheddar. It melts very well and still provides that flavor. Like I said last week, you can use sharp cheddar if you want, it just doesn't melt that well. And we got some Chihuahua Quesadilla cheese. Now this is a Mexican type of cheese that melts very well and it has a good flavor and it works perfectly for these enchiladas. You can also use Oaxacan cheese, which I used last week. Either one works, but I'm going with this one this week. But it provides a nice contrast to the cheddar cheese. Now if you want to use Mexican cheeses like this, just make sure it melts. For example, queso fresco, very common, but it doesn't melt. So just make sure the cheese will melt before you use it. And those are the ingredients. And just like last week, we're going to want to heat some oil in a skillet to fry the tortillas with. It doesn't really matter what temperature you bring it to. I have it between 375 and 400, but anything that's hot enough to fry the tortilla with. So while the oil's heating over there, we're going to make our roux. So take half a cup of Crisco and then half a cup of flour. We're going to use the 1-to-1 ratio here. So take half a cup of Crisco or whatever oil you're using and put it in a pan. Make sure you get it all out of there, put it in there, and then heat it up on a low heat. You want to melt the oil, and then as the oil's melting, you slowly introduce the flour and stir it in with a whisk. Now this is pretty important right here. You don't want to get this part wrong. You don't want to have to start over. What you're aiming to do here is get a roux that's dark enough and thick enough, but not burnt. That's why you want to do it on a low heat and slowly combine it. As the Crisco melts, spread it around like this. And if you're using an oil instead of Crisco, you don't have to worry about it melting. You can jump right away to heating it up and putting in the flour. And once the oil is hot enough, you can kind of turn the heat up. You don't want to do it on a low heat the entire time, but just to get it started. You don't want it to heat up too fast. I've done a roux a lot of times for a lot of different applications, but the first few times you do it, it can be kind of difficult. It's something you get better with over time. All right, and now I'm going to start adding my flour. Half a cup flour to go with a half cup of oil. So that's a 1/4 cup right there. Whisk it around, combine it, And you'll see it'll start bubbling like that. That's a good thing, but you don't want it to bubble too much. You're not trying to burn it. And then just whisk it around for a few minutes until you get a nice light brown color. You want to constantly whisk it around. You don't want it to sit there because that's how it burns. Just constantly whisk it around for about, I don't know, it usually takes about 3 minutes or so for me. But you want a nice light brown color. Okay, this is looking pretty good. I think we're ready to move on. So now we want to start adding our spices. So 2 teaspoons of salt. You can lower the heat a little bit while you're putting in the spices. Got half a tablespoon of black pepper. Whisk that around. Got 2 teaspoons of garlic powder. You got half a teaspoon of the oregano. And then the most important ingredient, we got 4 teaspoons of ground cumin. The cumin should turn it into a darker brown color, so just whisk it around. Okay, once that's all combined, we want to add the broth, an entire quart's worth. But don't add it all at once. Add a little bit, stir. Add a little bit, stir. And repeat until you've added the entire quart. And once you got all the broth poured in there, just turn the heat down to low, stir it around a bit, and then let it simmer, I don't know, about 16 minutes. It'll be thin right now, but as it simmers, it'll thicken up. And then the last ingredient, the most important one, I know I said the cumin was most important, but this is actually the most important, is your chili powder, 4 tablespoons. So once you've got all the broth added in, then you can add this. Just stir it around until it's combined. It should be a reddish brown color. And while that's going on, you can do 3 things. We can shred cheese, we can brown the ground beef, and we can fry our tortillas. So I am going to do the ground beef and the tortillas at the same time. So for the ground beef, it's not hard. You're browning ground beef. I mean, everybody's probably done that in their life. If you haven't, this video might not be for you. You need to learn how to use like an easy bake oven or something first. Now the ground beef is optional. I like it though. If you're not using the ground beef, you can honestly cut the chili gravy recipe in half. But if you're using ground beef, you want to use the amounts that I'm using for the chili gravy. Otherwise, when you add the ground beef, it'll be too thick and it won't be a sauce anymore. It'll be more like a stew. So one thing you want to do with the ground beef when you're browning it and after it's done browning is make sure it's broken up really well. You don't want any big chunks of beef in there. You want it to be minced very well. And while that's browning, I'm going to start frying the tortillas. So grab a plate and line it with some paper towels. I did this last week, but I'll do it again just in case you didn't watch my video last week. So for the tortillas, what you want to do is grab a pair of tongs, grab 1 tortilla at a time, place it in the oil, and then let it fry for about 10 seconds each side, maybe 15. What you're looking for here is a tortilla that is not crispy like a chip, but still cooked. You still want there to be some level of crisp on there. So about 10 to 15 seconds each side is what usually works for me. And then take it out, put it on the paper towels to dry, repeat the process 11 times. This recipe calls for 12 large corn tortillas. You could actually probably use more because that's actually a lot of sauce, but I start with 12 and go from there. When the ground beef is done browning, take it off the heat, set it aside, but still make sure it's broken up here. And continue to stir the chili gravy as it simmers. Still haven't grated my cheese yet. I said it last week, I'm gonna say it again this week. Do not buy pre-shredded cheese. Take the time and effort to grate cheese off the block. It is that much worth it. And the cheese in the bags, it's good, but it doesn't melt well. This is what you need. It tastes better, it melts better. If you're gonna go through all this trouble to make this, you might as well take the extra step, right? And not cut any corners. And once the chili gravy is done, you can tell when you're stirring it and it's just nice and thick, but not too thick. You can still pour and everything, but you'll know. It'll be a nice brown color, like this. Just turn the heat off and set it aside. This is completely optional, but one thing I like to do, I like to chop some cilantro and toss it in with the cheese that we're gonna put inside the tortillas and kind of mix it in there. Make sure you chop it up nice though. You don't want big petals in there. Oh man, I forgot. You gotta preheat the oven to 450. Man, I can't believe I forgot to do that. This oven takes a while to heat up. So in that case, it might not be a bad idea to put the chili gravy back on heat and just add a little bit of water, just so it doesn't get too thick and dried out. At least those of you watching the video, if you watch this video all the way before starting, you'll know to preheat the oven to 450. While the oven is heating up, you want to take a baking dish and you want to grease the hell out of it. I am saying grease it good. Otherwise, the enchiladas will stick and you will have an enchilada casserole instead of enchiladas. They will be nearly impossible to get out in one piece. Now what we want to do is take the chili gravy off the heat, get our ground beef, get our onions, and get our cheese. And with the ground beef, we want to add just a little bit to the gravy. You don't want to add all of it, otherwise all the beef will absorb the gravy and you won't have a gravy. You will have more of a chili or a stew. I don't know, maybe half of the ground beef can go in there. And then the other half of the ground beef, it's up to you. Give it to your dog, use it for something else later. I don't know, but you don't want to put too much in there, just a little bit. And that's why breaking it up is so important, because you still want this to be a sauce. So what you want to do is grab a spoon and just cover the bottom of the dish with the gravy. Just a very thin layer, not a lot, just enough to cover the bottom. And then we want to start rolling. So grab a tortilla, grab some cheese, put it in, take some of your onions, if you want onions, put them in there, and then roll it up like a cigar. Place it seam side down in the dish. And you want to spread these somewhat apart in the dish because otherwise they'll be hard to separate later on. And then you just repeat for all 12 of them. And then when you're done rolling your tortillas, you want to take your gravy and just spoon the rest of it over the top. Make sure it's all covered. Might as well use all of it. You don't have to use, if you plan on using more than 12 tortillas, you can definitely be a bit more conservative, but I don't, so I'm just gonna go ahead and use all of it. And there we go. And remember that cheese I was talking about earlier from last week? The problem with cheddar cheese, especially sharp cheddar cheese, is that it loses its flavor pretty quickly when you're storing it, especially in terms of sharpness. So I'm not gonna put it inside the tortilla, but I am gonna top the chili gravy with it. Any excess cheese you can definitely put on top, like I'm doing here. Also, any additional onions you want to put on top, I'm going to sprinkle some. And then we just wait for the oven to finish preheating. It's at 320 right now. So once the oven is done preheating, we can put them in. And once the oven is preheated to 450 degrees, stick it in there for 10 minutes. You're going to want to let it cool off a little bit, obviously. Top with any additional cilantro you want to top with, like I'm doing right here. But I usually let it stand for about 10 minutes or so, otherwise you're going to burn your mouth. Yeah, I'd say I nailed it. I nailed it. And that's your classic brown enchilada, aka cheese enchilada. You can find it in Mexican restaurants, but it's pretty expensive. You can make all that for like 25 bucks max and get a lot more for your buck. That wraps up Game Day Cooking for this week. Tune in next week, I got more coming.